The thunderhead rolled over Rochester like a slow train, grumbling as it went, shaking the panes in the old houses on Lake Avenue and throwing a quicksilver sheen over the streets. By the time the first bolt cracked open the sky, Detective Jack Morneau was already out of his car, rain driving under his collar and down his back, flashlight in one hand, notebook in the other. He aimed the beam at something sprawled near the cut bank where the shoulder slumped toward a ditch. The beam licked metal, powder blue paint flaking like old nail polish, vines clutching at spokes as if they had hands. A bicycle lay on its side, its wicker basket collapsed in on itself, one handlebar bent like a crooked arm reaching for help that never came. "Don't touch a thing," Morneau said, more to the dark than to the rookie who'd followed him down the slope. The storm pushed rain sideways, making everything look smudged and indeterminate. His mind did what it always did, tied the image to a feeling he didn't have a name for and filed it in a place he could reach later. "Took the call off a jogger," the rookie said he almost tripped over it. "Thought it was a kid's bike until he saw it was older." "How long you think that's been here?" Morneau asked. His voice sounded flat inside the rain. "Couple months, year," the rookie shrugged, then flinched when the sky lit white. Morneau worked his jaw. He crouched and let the light skate over the frame where numbers were ghosting through rust. He didn't write them yet, not by rainlight, not in a ditch. He took in the angle, the way the front wheel had settled into the mud and the back had gone light, as if the bike had tried to leap and been yanked back by an invisible hand. Above them, traffic hissed. The sodium lamps along the park trail threw crooked shadows through the trees. Morneau stood, knees protesting, and wiped rain from his eyes. "Bag it," he said. "We'll do it right in the morning." He didn't know why he looked over his shoulder. At the same moment, the thunder rolled away and left a vacuum of quiet, just the tick of cooling metal somewhere and the soft, wet whisper of leaves. Later, he would tell himself he was only checking the rookie. But in that second, the back of his neck prickled and the hair on his forearms lifted, and a sentence formed and refused to go. "This is not the first thing. This is what's left." 12 hours earlier, the town had still been bright, the air thick with cut grass and gasoline. Evelyn Carter pedaled past the hedge on Oak Avenue, her white nurse's shoes drumming softly on the pedals, lunch pail empty in the basket, cap pinned neat in her hair. She had an early shift at St. Mary's, a long day in Peds, then home to make a pot roast if the chuck was on special at Wegmans. Her legs ached from the last hour, a 6-year-old boy with pneumonia who cried when the mask went on. She had sung "You Are My Sunshine" until the child had fallen asleep holding her thumb. Children did that, borrowed your hand like it was the only anchor that kept them from sliding off the world. She loved the ride home. She loved the smallness of it. Elm Street, then left on First, past the bakery where heat spilled into the sidewalk, past Mrs. Hutchins' garden where the hose arced like glass in the sun. Safe, predictable, a line she could draw with her eyes closed. Her mind wandered the way minds do when they trust the road. Should she plant zinnias next spring? Could she afford the little house with the window seat if she took 2 doubles a week for a year? The sedan let her know it was there by not making a sound. Black, a boxy model with chrome that caught the light and threw it back like a dare. It came up behind and then beside, gliding alongside as if it were a companion. She felt it before she saw it, that tiny bend in the air pressure, the awareness of mass. She tipped her chin and smiled the polite smile you offer men on streets whether you want to or not. The passenger window stayed up. The driver remained a silhouette behind glass and sun. At the next intersection, the sedan slowed. So did she. The driver's side window unrolled an inch. Nothing, no voice, no cat call, just that strange quiet, as if the car were holding its breath and waiting for her to do the talking. She didn't. She pushed through the intersection, felt her pulse tick in her throat, and told herself she was being dramatic. People were allowed to drive. She turned onto Elm. The sedan kept going. Relief spilled into her body like a warm bath. She laughed at herself and pedaled harder. When she reached the corner near the narrow cut-through behind the old maintenance yard, she slowed again. The cut-through saved a minute, maybe 2. She'd used it 100 times. trees crowded close, leaves giving off the peppery green smell that comes right before rain in July. She slid into the cool shade with the kind of relief that made your shoulder blades drop. She didn't see the second car until the shadow changed shape ahead of her and the path narrowed as if it were exhaling. By 6 o'clock, the sky had bruised up and Maggie Carter was standing at her kitchen window, staring out at the alley where the thunderheads were stacking. The coffee she'd made at 4 sat cold in the pot. The clock on the wall was a little cow with rolling eyes, one of those silly wedding gifts everyone snickers at. The cow said 6:03. Evelyn's call usually came at 6 sharp, the phone line whistling a breath of static, then Evie's voice. You would not believe what came out of a boy's nose today. She made everything sound like a story, even mucus. Maggie checked the phone again. She lifted the receiver to see if the line was dead. It was. She dialed St. Mary S. and asked for the nurse's station in pediatrics. A bored voice said she clocked out 15 minutes late, left at 3:05. You missed your call. The voice had that edge people reserve for anxious women, sugar-coating the judgment so it slides down smooth. She never misses, Maggie said. Maybe she took a nap, the voice said. Big day here. Right, Maggie said and hung up. Her husband Tommy came in from the garage, hands striped with motor oil, a smudge on his cheek. He hung his cap, kissed her shoulder, poured the cold coffee and drank it anyway. She'll call, he said. You don't know that. Her voice was too quick, too high, a violin string in a hot room. Maybe she ran into a friend, maybe the payphone ate her dime. We lived without phones once, you know. This is not the day you should pick to be old-fashioned, Maggie said, then closed her eyes and brought her hands to her face. Sorry, something's wrong. You want me to drive you over there? He asked, and made it sound like a concession he would regret later. He loved Evelyn, but he loved quiet more. Yes, they drove across town with the storm pacing them, the sky doing that odd thing where it takes on a greenish tint, and you think of tornadoes even if you've never seen one. They climbed the steps to Evelyn's building, the hallway smelling like varnish and boiled cabbage. Maggie had a spare key. The lock turned and she stepped into that small, careful world, bed made tight enough to bounce a quarter, nurse's cap resting on the dresser like a white paper bird, Tuesday's uniform ironed and hanging from the closet door with the belt tie looped like a smile. Evie, Maggie called, though she knew. The kitchen told her more than the bedroom did. Coffee cup washed and upside down on the drying rack. A small list on the counter in Evelyn's round, tidy script. Chuck roast if under $1.29/lb. Carrots, potatoes, paper towels, stamps. The question mark hollowed Maggie out. A small domestic punctuation mark with the weight of a church bell. She didn't come home, she said. Tommy did a slow turn, taking in the same scene, his face guarded in that particular masculine way that looks like indifference and is actually a fragile kind of mercy. We should call, he said. They went to the station at 8:45 and perched on the hard bench while a kid with acne behind the glass slid forms through a slot like he was dealing cards. The room smelled like wet wool and floor polish. A man in cuffs laughed too loud at a joke his own mouth had made. When Sergeant Ron Bell finally invited them in, he did it with a sigh, the kind you use when a child drags you back to the same question for the 5th time. He had the wide, sunburned forehead of an upstate lifer and a ring groove where his wedding band had been, either today or forever, hard to say. So, he said, pen poised, an adult woman, 29, 32, Maggie said. She looks younger, 32, not home by 6, you called her workplace. She left at 3:05, you said. No history of what, depression, drinking, boyfriends. Maggie and Tommy traded a look like they were deciding whether to speak up in church. She keeps to herself, Maggie said. No boyfriends I know of. Sergeant Bell nodded, a smile ghosting the corner of his mouth. Sisters don't always know everything. The way he said it told Maggie he thought that was wisdom, like he collected little sayings and set them on a shelf behind his eyes. Sergeant, Maggie said, and the tremor in her voice hardened to something he couldn't chalk up to nerves. Evelyn is not a flake, she is a nurse. She pays her bills on time. She calls me every day at 6 o'clock, and she waters my violets when I go up to my mother's in Irondequoit. She doesn't disappear. Belle's pen hovered, then moved again. We usually ask folks to wait 24 hours, ma'am. Adults have the right to leave if they want to. You'd be surprised how often there's a little argument or an old flame. We didn't argue, Maggie said. And she doesn't have an old flame. If she did, my phone would have rung in 69 and 70 and 71 when I had babies and needed help. 24 hours, Belle said gently, as if he were a nurse now, as if he had stolen Evelyn's tone on the way into work. If she isn't back by then, we'll make this official. Maggie's mouth opened and then closed so she wouldn't cry in front of him. Tommy put his hand on her knee. They stood. Belle offered a card like the kind a dentist hands over along with free floss. On their way out, the man in cuffs laughed again and then began to cough, the real kind, the kind that shakes you. Maggie flinched like she'd been hit. Back home, the storm cracked open the sky at last. Rain pummeled the street in hard pellets, the first fat drops popping like popcorn on the sidewalk, then the rest coming in hot behind them. Maggie sat at the kitchen table, telephone at her elbow, Evelyn's photograph propped against the salt shaker. It was one of those department store portraits with a soft gray backdrop and a little blur at the edges to make you look like a haloed version of yourself. Evie's smile was real. They always said you could tell in photographs. You could. Maybe she had to stay late, Tommy said again, and even as he said it, he knew it was a cheap sentence and no good at all. Then she would have called, Maggie said. She wrote the words she knew she would need tomorrow on a yellow legal pad. Last seen 3:15 p.m., blue Schwinn, white cap, Elm Street route. She wrote them because if she didn't write, she would have to sit there with the sound of the storm and the small clock cow blinking and her own heart hitting its little metal bell inside her ribs. At midnight, she called the hospital again. A new voice this time, tired and husky, told her the same facts, as if facts could shore up anything. She slept in 10-minute drops, the way you sleep on a plane with your mouth open, the body refusing the kindness of real rest. At 4:15, she rose and made fresh coffee, forgot to drink it, and walked back to the phone as if she could coax it to ring by pacing grooves into the linoleum. When dawn ran its thumb over the rooftops, Maggie phoned her neighbor to watch the kids and drove the route Evelyn always took. She rolled the streets as if the asphalt might give up a secret if you softened your voice and asked nice. She pulled to the curb beside Mrs. Hutchins' garden and sat there with the window down as the older woman crouched in rubber boots, pushing soil around the base of a hollyhock. Eliza, Maggie called. The name came out like a swallow, Divey's, quick, necessary. Did you see Evie yesterday? Mrs. Hutchins straightened, the hose kinking and unkinking around her ankles. She was a big woman with arms like good bread, soft and strong both. Around 3:30, she said. She waved. She mimed it, a little lift of the hand, the kind of wave you do when you are part of the scenery and still grateful to be seen. She was fine. Which way did she turn at the end of Oak? Maggie asked. Elm, Hutchins said, same as always. She squinted past Maggie's shoulder toward the sky. We're getting weather. Maggie nodded like weather had anything to do with her, then drove on. The cut-through behind the old maintenance yard was new since they were girls, a path young moms used with strollers, teenagers used to sneak cigarettes. She parked where she wasn't supposed to and walked in, the soles of her flats finding the damp places and telling her it had rained here in the night even if it hadn't rained on her street. The trees held the air close. Birdsong made it sound wholesome. Maggie followed the curve until it spat her into a small clearing where the weeds shoulder up to your thigh and the ground tells you stories if you know how to listen. She didn't find anything that morning but a candy wrapper and a bottle cap. Still, something in the place put a fingerprint on her and did not let go. She went home and made copies of a photograph and shook her hands when the machine jammed, cursed under her breath in a way her mother would have scolded, then stacked the flyers on the counter until they looked like a paper city. She scrounged tape from the junk drawer and a stapler with 2 good staples left. She went out and wallpapered the town with her need. By 10, the flyers were in the diner window and the barber's shop and the vet's hall where old men sat and told lies. At noon, a teenager in a denim jacket told her he thought he saw a woman who looked like that at a bus station, and Maggie drove there and parked kite-like and desperate, scanning faces until they all began to look like Evelyn, because that's what grief does first, turns every person into the one who is gone. At 2, she stood in front of St. Mary's and stared at the double doors, thinking how many times those doors had sucked her sister in and spit her out again, how many little tragedies and little jokes had walked those tiles, how much mercy had been handed out like sandwiches in that place. She wanted to sit on the curb and cry, and instead she walked to the security office and asked for the serial number of a bicycle. "Ma'am," the guard said, eyebrows climbing. He was built like a refrigerator and had the gentle eyes of a Labrador. "We don't. You registered bikes last year when they were stealing from the lot," she said, trying not to sound like a woman who memorized the world. "You had a clipboard, June to August, blue Schwinn, Carter, Evelyn." The guard blinked, then disappeared into a small room that smelled like wet wool and coffee. When he returned, he had a card with numbers and letters on it, the kind that don't mean anything until they mean everything. He let her copy them in her careful hand. She wrote slow so the ink would set and not smudge. She folded the paper and put it in her wallet, a treasure. That evening the storm finally huffed itself out and left the town washed and sullen. Tommy told her to eat something. She ate 2 bites of toast and then stood at the sink holding the plate in both hands like it might grow heavy and drop. She called the station again and asked for the sergeant. They put her on hold long enough to make her believe she might die of old age right there with the receiver pressed to her face. When Bell picked up, he had that first day of football voice men get in September. "We'll open a file first thing in the morning," he said. "I'll assign someone." "Who?" she asked. "Detective Jack Morneau," he said. "Solid guy." "Tell him," Maggie said carefully, letting each word bridge to the next without falling, "this is not a woman who left." When she hung up, the house was too quiet, and the clock's glassy cow eyes did their stupid little roll as if time were a joke. Maggie turned the face to the wall and listened instead to the smaller clock inside her, the one that set to Evelyn's voice years ago and refused to reset. Outside, the street steamed, the August twilight red as a bruise over the lake, and somewhere across town a man crouched in a ditch with a flashlight, reading numbers he didn't write down because rain has a way of making you careful around the truth. By morning, the storm had rinsed the town clean, but Maggie woke feeling like grit still clung to her ribs. She dressed the children, left them with Mrs. Price next door with a $10 bill and a promise she couldn't keep, "I'll be back before lunch," and drove to the station with her coffee going cold between her knees. Inside, fluorescent lights flattened every face. The desk sergeant wouldn't look at her while he slid the forms across, as if eye contact might obligate him to care. She pushed the papers back with the neat precision of a woman who had spent a decade keeping a household from flying apart. "You said a detective," she reminded him. "Morneau," he said, like the name should be enough. Detective Jack Morneau arrived with his tie loose and his hair still damp from the shower, carrying a legal pad stabbed with 3 paper clips. He wasn't smiling. She liked him for that. He guided her into a little interview room that smelled of cigarettes and last night's coffee. "Mrs. Carter," he said, and his voice had range in it, low, even. "I'm sorry we're meeting like this. Tell me everything again as if I don't know it." She did this time slower, placing facts like stepping stones and refusing to leave any wobbly. He wrote, not nodding along, not consoling, just listening. When she paused, his pen kept moving, catching up to her. "When did you last see her?" he asked. "Sunday after church. We split a lemon muffin at Granger's and talked about whether stamps were going up again. She said she was going to try a pot roast if the chuck was under $1.30. "That's specific," he said, not unkindly. "She's specific," Maggie said. "She's a nurse. She logs her life." He tapped the pad once with the pen. "We'll start with the route home. I've got uniform canvassing up and down Oak and Elm. I'll talk to St. Mary's, her floor supervisor, the security office. We'll check bus depots, stations, ERs. I won't insult you by pretending we do everything perfectly, but I'll tell you the truth when I have it. Is the 24 hours over? She asked, hating the salt in her throat. He glanced at the wall clock. It's over. Sergeant Bell stuck his head in. Jack, we need you on. Not now, Morneau said, and the sergeant pulled back like the door had shoved him. When the interview ended, Morneau walked her to the lobby. Go home for a bit, he said. If your phone rings, I need you there. I'm not a woman you have to tuck away, she said. I can walk with you. And I don't tuck women anywhere, he said. But your kids need you more than I do in the next 2 hours. He was right. It made her angrier. At St. Mary's, Morneau stood in a triangle of disappointment with the head nurse and a hospital administrator whose suit looked more expensive than the hallway warranted. The head nurse, Pat Collins, a woman with a jaw like a general and kindness seamed into the lines around her eyes, folded her arms. Evelyn's solid, she said, never late, patients love her. If she took off, it'd be the first time she ran from anything. The administrator lifted both hands like traffic signals. We're happy to cooperate, detective, but your policy is going to make me need a subpoena if we get cute, Morneau said, pleasantly enough that the man blinked. Patient privacy, staff privacy, the admin said. I can't have us accused of. You can have a missing nurse, Pat cut in, that you can have. Morneau thanked them, asked for schedules, coworker lists, a locker search. Pat snapped orders, and in a minute 2 nurses were untangling the contents of Evelyn's small metal locker, a folded paperback with the spine broken at chapter 15, an apple II soft, a roll of quarters in a paper tube. Morneau turned the roll in his palm. She do laundry, or is this for pay phones? Phones, Pat said. She always has change. Because she always makes the call, Morneau said, halfway to himself. He signed for a copy of the time sheet and passed the security office to request films he knew they didn't have. We don't get that fancy until 84, the guard said with an apologetic tilt of the head, and walked out into sun that hadn't earned its cheerfulness. Maggie was stapling flyers to the corkboard at the grocery store when a woman with a cart crowded with cereal boxes and canned soup leaned in, voice down. You hear what they're saying, that maybe she had a friend no one knows, a married friend, you know. Who's saying that? Maggie asked. People, the woman said and shrugged like people was a bell that rang on its own. I'm sure it's nonsense. But it is Rochester, everybody knows everything. Maggie pressed the staple down so hard the metal crunched the cork. Everybody knows nothing, she said, and walked out with her hands shaking so badly she couldn't get her keys into the ignition on the first try. By afternoon, she and Morneau were both combing Elm. He knocked on doors. She talked to anyone who'd roll a window down. At the corner, Mrs. Hutchins waved them over with her hose still running, water making a dark river in the gutter. 3:30, she said again. She waved. That's what I have for you. You see any cars? Morneau asked. Unfamiliar ones. There's a black one, Mrs. Hutchins said, brows knitting. That creeps, not every day, but some afternoons. A big one all chrome, doesn't idle right like it's missing a heartbeat. You get a plate? He asked, knowing the answer. I'm a gardener detective, she said, not a cop. Down the block, a teenager in a varsity jacket claimed he saw Evelyn turn toward Maple, not Elm. A construction worker swore a nurse had stopped for an ice cream at Corsi's and never finished it. Corsi himself said he hadn't seen her since Easter. A middle-aged man with a comb-over and a habit of leaning too close told Maggie, a girl like that, if she wanted to leave, she could. You'd be surprised how many do. I would, Maggie said. I would be astonished. At dusk, she drove home to relieve Mrs. Price, whose patients had a 12-hour fuse. Her daughter fell asleep with her thumb in her mouth, and her little boy asked, Is Aunt Evie lost? And she lied with more ease than she'd thought herself capable of. After she tucked them in, she sat at the kitchen table and spread the map she'd torn from the phone book, tracing Evelyn's route with a red pen until the line looked like a wound. Tommy came in late, smelling of sweat and axle grease. You're scaring the kids, he said without preamble. You're scaring me. Good, she said. Fear makes people move. He put his hands on the back of a chair and lined. You want me to say the thing you don't want to hear? Sometimes people choose. It doesn't make them bad. She looked up at him with eyes she could feel had gone hard. Say it again and you can sleep in your truck. The phone rang at 9:17. She snatched it up so fast the cord scraped a line across the table. Evelyn, silence, then a breath, male, close to the receiver. Stop, the voice said, a whisper thin as paper. You have kids, stop. Who is this? Her voice stayed level because she forced it to. Say your name. The line clicked dead. Tommy had heard enough to go pale. Prank, he said, trying the word on, finding it too small. Maggie set the receiver down with care, like it was glass, and she was the only person left who knew what it was worth. She dialed Morneau's number from the card he'd tucked into her palm at the station. He answered on the second ring. Don't tell me to calm down, she said by way of hello. Tell me what to do. Did you recognize it? He asked. No, but I'll never not recognize it again. I'll have a car sit on your block tonight, he said. Don't pick up again unless it's me. Pick up every call, she said. Write every threat down. That's what you were about to say, right? He was quiet a second. That's what I was about to say. Then I'll do both, she said, and hung up. Outside, the heat of the day leaked back out of the sidewalks, a slow exhale that made the street shimmer. Somewhere a dog barked itself hoarse and then gave up. Maggie turned the cow clock face up again and pressed her thumb into the glass until she could see the little half-moons it made on her skin. Fear had entered the house and taken a chair. She set another chair beside it for rage. At 11:03 the phone rang again. This time she let it go once, twice, then answered. You called the police, the man said, still whispering, still close. You think they help, they don't. Stop. Come say that at my door, she said. Silence, then laughter, soft and private. The line clicked. She kept the receiver against her ear a long minute after, listening to the vacuum where a person had been. Then she wrote down every second of it, the time, the words, the way the laugh had landed like something dropped from a height. In a little office with a coffee ring on his blotter, Morneau stared at the list of names he'd made, Hutchins, Corsi, Collins, and drew a small circle around the word black sedan. He had cases stacked like cordwood, a sergeant who wanted him on a burglary string, and a wife at home who would be asleep by now whether he came or not. He picked up the phone and called the night shift to park a cruiser on Maggie's block and then closed his eyes against the hum of the fluorescent light. He could hear the whisper, too, even though he hadn't been in the house to catch it. Stop. The thing about orders was they only worked if you ceded your agency. He pictured Maggie at her table with a map and a red pen, and he pictured a man in the dark who liked the sound of his own breath. He kept his eyes closed and promised nobody in particular that one of those people would not get what he wanted. The cruiser parked at the end of Maggie's block all night, headlights off, 2 officers taking turns sipping coffee that tasted like burnt paper. The calls didn't come again. Dawn softened the street to watercolor, and for a few minutes the world pretended everything was ordinary. At 8:30, Detective Jack Morneau knocked on Maggie's door with a small paper bag and the kind of careful politeness people use around grief. Bagels from Granger, S., he said. Cream cheese in a little tub because I don't gamble with butter. She blinked at the bag, at him, at the children fighting quietly over a single green crayon in the living room. Thank you, she said, meaning it more than she wanted to. He set the bag on the table beside the map with its red line and sat without being asked. You logged the calls, times words, nothing numbers, she said. Blocked or pay phone, the laugh. She rubbed her forearm like it itched. It was private. He wrote private laugh and underlined it once, then looked up. It's meant to make you feel watched. It worked because you're human, but there's another way to read it. He's nervous too. People who feel powerful don't whisper, they deliver. Is that supposed to make me feel better? Maggie asked. No, Morneau said. It's supposed to make you feel accurate. He told her his plan in nouns, canvas, DMV, bus station, yards, route. She listened, nodding at the parts that sounded like action, frowning at the parts that sounded like paper. He paused at the door. I want a photo for the press, he said. Not the glamour one on the salt shaker, the one that looks like her on a Tuesday. Maggie went to Evelyn's apartment and came back with a Polaroid she'd taken on a winter morning. Evie in a pea coat, hair tucked under a knit hat, cheeks pink, eyes laughing at something Maggie had said. Morno held it by the edges like evidence and also like a human face. He headed to St. Mary's first. In the nurse's lounge, the coffee was as mean as the fluorescent lights. Pat Collins scolded the percolator with the authority of a woman who'd made bad machines behave for decades, then sat with Morno and a list of names. "Who closes with her?" he asked. "Dr. Harrison, Ped's attending, Nurse Rita Morales, orderly named Kevin who thinks he's Sinatra, and whoever pulled the late shift in respiratory." She squinted at the schedule. "Gwen, she's new." "Any visitors late yesterday?" Morno asked. "Anyone unusual?" Pat snorted. "You want me to say no so the story stays tidy? This is a hospital, detective. Death and birth come through here 30 times a day, and they bring weird cousins and angry fathers and drunk uncles and a nun who carries peppermints like ammunition. Yesterday I had a man who insisted his wife was allergic to oxygen. Yesterday I had a priest who fainted. Yesterday was an average day." He almost smiled. Did Evelyn ever have trouble, harassment, a patient's relative getting handsy, a coworker who couldn't keep a boundary? "She's pretty, but that's not the trouble she had," Pat said. "She's steady. The trouble pretty usually brings doesn't stick to steady. She's polite in that way that makes men behave because they don't want to look small. Any talk about a boyfriend? God, not this," Pat said and then softened. "If she had one, it was the kind you don't run your mouth about. Private girl, reads on her break, knits in winter, volunteers for the flu clinic in February when everyone else pretends to be sick." He took notes, then worked down his list. Dr. Harrison had a face that never stopped thinking and hands that kept checking his pockets as if something important lived there. "She stayed an extra 20 to calm a mother," Harrison said. "That's the last I saw. She looked tired, but that's the job." "You ever drive Oak or Elm around 3? Morno asked. "Notice any cars camping the route?" "I noticed disease patterns and malpractice premiums, detective," Harrison said. "Cars aren't my plague." In respiratory, Gwen, a recent transplant from Ohio with acne along the jawline and a sweetness that made Morno want to keep her in a safe, twisted her fingers and said she'd seen Evelyn in the hallway around 2, smiling at nothing like she does when she's thinking about a book. Rita Morales, sorting a tray of syringes with the precise contempt of a professional who had been underpaid for too long, said Evelyn had been late once in the last month by 3 minutes and had apologized like she'd missed Christmas. By noon, Morna was outside along Oak again, shoes picking up grit, tie darkening where sweat had found it. He knocked on a row of doors and collected a bouquet of memory errors. Harold Jenkins, a construction worker with plaster dust in his hair and a permanent squint, leaned against his porch rail. "She was talking to a man in a dark sedan," he said, "right there at Oak and Pine around 4. He pointed with a cigarette, ash dropping onto his boot. Window down, her leaning in, didn't look scared. Looked like she might have known him. You get a plate?" Morno asked. "Hell no," Jenkins said. "I don't even remember what I had for lunch." Next, Billy Crawford, 17, varsity jacket hanging open like armor, pimples blooming under the fuzz on his lip. "She turned toward Maple for sure," he said, certain with the certainty of youth. "I was on my bike. We nod at each other sometimes." "She was booking it, fast like scared?" Morno asked. "Fast like she had somewhere to be," Billy said. "You don't get it. Nurses move like they're late even when they're early." Mrs. Dorothy Walsh insisted she'd seen Evelyn push her bike into Riverside Park. "She stops sometimes and watches the geese," she said, then narrowed her eyes at Morno. "You married, your wife ever watch a thing like it had the answer to something?" That was the look. A park maintenance worker, Jose Martinez, produced a logbook with times and tasks and said he'd been raking near the East Path all afternoon. "Saw a couple necking and a kid collecting pop bottles," Martinez said. "No nurse." Morno wrote it all down, even the contradictions, especially the contradictions. He knew the mind loved a story and would sand down the edges of truth to make a narrative fit. He also knew that outliers, one odd detail that didn't match the others, sometimes turned out to be the only honest voice in the room. He circled sedan dark, drew a line to black car chrome, Hutchins, then drew a question mark between Maple and Riverside. He wished he could paper the map like Maggie had and draw in red until it bled through. At the bus station, he checked with a driver who claimed he'd seen a woman like Evelyn board a Greyhound to Buffalo. She had a blue bag, the driver said. And one of them little lunch pails like kids. The ticket agent shook his head before Morneau finished the question. No ticket in that name since '70, he said, and I remember because I used to date a girl named Evelyn. It's a ruined name, you know what I mean. Morneau did not know what he meant. He left with nothing but the smell of diesel on his shirt. Back on Elm, he found Maggie outside a corner store taping another flyer to the glass. Her hands had steadied, her eyes hadn't. A woman was talking at her while not quite facing her, voice low. I'm not saying it's true, honey, I'm saying people talk. Married men are generous. My sister's friend, Maggie turned her head slowly like it took muscle to do it. How much does a roomer pay exactly? She asked. Is it more than a nurse makes an hour? Because if it is, maybe I'll take up lying. The woman's mouth tightened and she scuttled away. Morneau stepped closer. You need air, he said. I need Evelyn, she said. Air is free, my sister is. He told her about Jenkins, Crawford, Walsh, Martinez. He told her about the bus station. He did not tell her about Gwen's acne or Dr. Harrison's pockets. Not everything belonged to a sister. So everyone saw something different, she said. That's comfort. It's data, he said. It gets less useless the more we gather. Is that a promise? She asked. It's statistics, he said, and when that didn't land, he forced a smile. And I'm stubborn, that helps. She exhaled and nodded toward the corner. Mrs. Hutchins said that black chrome sedan shows up some afternoons around 3. I thought I'd sit on my porch with a glass of iced tea and look like trouble. You look like you could pull it off, he said, then sobered. Do it with a friend and don't follow anyone. You giving that advice to yourself, detective? She asked. Or just to the ladies with iced tea? Both, he said. He moved next to the DMV, where he learned that dark sedan with chrome described half of upstate New York. He requested lists of owners of black Buicks and Chevys registered in the last 5 years within a 5-mile radius, knowing the printout would be thick as a phone book and about as precise. You want miracles, go to church, the clerk said, smacking the dot matrix printer like it owed her rent. At 3:45, Morneau parked half a block down from Oak and Pine and watched the corner. He watched the way bored people watch, eyes open, mind idling at just the right RPM to leap if anything twitched. A black Buick rolled through at 3:52, chrome winking in the late sun. He pulled behind it, slow and casual, running the plate with a mumble into the radio. Registered to a Walter Branson, dispatch said. Address on Leon, age 58. Branson's house on Leon had a yard where the grass looked shaved, not cut, and a porch with furniture no one sat in. He knocked. The man who opened had the pale eyes of someone who didn't go outside much and the kind of stillness that made you think of snakes. He wore a short-sleeved dress shirt and a tie with a stain like a thumbprint. Detective, Branson said, reading the badge quick and precise. We all write today. Routine, Morneau lied. We're asking about a nurse who rides a blue Schwinn down Oak around 3. You drive that way often? Sometimes, Branson said. Work in maintenance all over, lots of jobs on that side of town. You have a route that takes you there yesterday at 3:30, Morneau asked, pen up. Branson smiled with his lips but not his eyes. If I'd known you were going to ask today, detective, I would have worn a watch yesterday. I can get your time cards from your jobs, Morneau said. Or we could spare each other the romance and you can tell me where you were. Branson tilted his head as if he were listening to something far away. People disappear in cities, he said. It's not a scandal, it's math. I'm asking about one person, Morneau said. She's not a statistic to me. Branson's smile thinned. Then I hope you find her. He started to close the door, then paused. You married, why? Morneau asked. Because men like you always think you can save 2 families at once, Branson said, and closed the door all the way. On the sidewalk, Morneau wrote the word maintenance and underlined it. He wrote snake stillness and then scribbled it out because he wasn't a poet and because descriptions that relied on personal revulsion got cops sued. He wrote 58 Leon Buick Black and put 2 hard lines under the plate number. Night came early that day, clouds muscling in from the lake. At home, Maggie tried to boil pasta and forgot to salt the water. The kids made a fort and demanded she crawl inside. She did, because that was a way to breathe that didn't feel like gulping. Tommy came home with a stiffness in him that made the kitchen smaller. He watched her tape another flyer to the fridge and said, "You can't keep doing this to yourself. What's the alternative?" she asked, not looking up. "Letting the police do their job," he said, "letting God do his. God doesn't staple," she said, "and Belle wants me to wait." Tommy looked at the fort at their children's small feet sticking out like pale eggs. "I want my wife back," he said quietly. "You can have her when I have my sister," she said, and the sentence hung between them like a wet coat that wouldn't dry. At 10:11 the phone rang again. She let it go once, answered on the second ring. "Stop," the whisper said. "You're putting the wrong picture on things." "Then come correct me," Maggie said. "Use your big boy voice." A soft laugh. "You're fun," he said, and she felt the word like a hand on her neck. The line went dead. She wrote everything down and called Morneau. "He said I'm putting the wrong picture on things," she said. "What does that mean?" "It means he wants to be the one in charge of the story," Morneau said. "Don't give it to him." He hesitated. "I talked to a man who doesn't like light. He drives a black Buick." "Is he the one?" she asked, voice small for the first time all day. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I don't like that he likes me." "Get in line," she said, and then, to her own surprise, laughed a little. It sounded like something breaking and something beginning at the same time. When she hung up, she stood at the window and watched the cruiser idle under the streetlight. She felt fear and fury take up their chairs again, and something else. A wire of resolve pulled so tight it sang when the house shifted. Somewhere in a house with shaved grass, a man rinsed a glass and did not think of her at all. Somewhere at a desk with a coffee ring, a man circled names and promised statistics would bend. And somewhere in the wet air between them, Evelyn's name hovered, not yet a ghost, not yet gone. The following morning, Maggie woke to a stillness that didn't feel like peace. The cruiser was gone, the street damp and wrinkled like a sheet no one smoothed. She poured coffee and stared at the steam as if it held letters that might rearrange into her sister's name. The phone sat heavy and quiet. She hated it for that. At 9, a soft knock came at the door. Mrs. Price, already in sneakers and a sweatshirt, held out a casserole under foil. "From church," she said. "The ladies said to tell you there's more if you need it." "Tell them I appreciate the starch and the kindness," Maggie said, taking the warm weight. Mrs. Price shifted, reluctant to leave. "Maggie, folks are talking. I shut it down where I can, but you know how it is." "How is it?" Maggie asked, not sure she wanted to hear her life in someone else's past tense. "They say the calls could be a stunt," Mrs. Price said, flushing. "That sometimes in these things people like attention. I told them you don't even like attention when it's your birthday." Maggie's laugh came out dry. "If I wanted attention, I'd dye my hair red and start smoking menthols outside Mass. People get ugly when they're scared," Mrs. Price said. "They make up stories to cover the empty." "Then we're going to fill the empty," Maggie said. "Thank you for the kindness." She set the casserole down and dialed the station. Sergeant Bell's voice came through with the clink of ceramic in the background. She pictured him stirring sugar into his coffee like it owed him money. "Any news?" she asked. "We're working leads," he said. "Detective Morneau is thorough. These things take time." "Time is what a person who's not missing says," she shot back. "What about the black Buick, the man on Leon?" "Can't chase every Buick in Monroe County," Bell said. "You want us to harass a citizen based on the color of his car. I want you to investigate a man who answers a door like he's rehearsed it," she said, surprising herself with the sharpness in her voice. "Ma'am," Bell said, the word a warning and an endearment in neither. She hung up before she begged. Then she grabbed her keys and drove to Leon herself because she wasn't good at waiting, and because the only thing worse than doing something wrong was doing nothing at all. Branson's block had the clipped feel of a neighborhood that had decided nothing bad could happen if you mowed enough. Maggie parked 2 houses down in her Ford with the cracked dashboard and watched his porch. On the step sat a clay pot with soil and no plant. The absence felt intentional, like a dare. The front door opened. A man in a short-sleeved dress shirt stepped out with a thermos and a lunch pail hung off his wrist. He locked the door with precise turns and walked to the Buick parked at the curb. The chrome winked in the morning light like a man flashing a ring. Maggie didn't realize she'd opened her door until the cool air hit her legs. She stepped out. He turned his head as if he'd felt a shadow fall across his name. "Mr. Branson," she called, heart doing a frantic little jog in place. He squinted, the corners of his eyes an odd, soft web. "Do I know you?" His tone was neighborly without warmth, the verbal equivalent of a handshake you'd forgotten before it ended. "I'm Evelyn Carter's sister," she said. "You drive Oak a lot. That a crime?" he asked. The small smile didn't reach his irises. "Lot of people drive Oak. You drive it slowly," she said, "like you're memorizing." "Like I'm avoiding potholes," he said. "You should too. They'll bend your rim." A curtain lifted in the house across the street. Maggie felt the prickle of an audience and didn't care. "Did you talk to her on Monday?" she asked. "At Oak and Pine." He tilted his head as if her question were an interesting insect. "I talk to people when they talk to me," he said. "Otherwise I keep to myself. That's how you get old." "You have a black Buick with chrome," she said, ridiculous and true. "Good eye," he said, and turned the key in the driver's side. "You should talk to the cops instead of standing in front of a man's house." "I did," she said. "They told me to wait." He opened the door and paused, his mouth going thinner. "Waiting is how people get used to things," he said. "Careful with it." He slid in, shut the door, and drove off like he had all the time in the world. Maggie stood in the street with her hands curled and unclenched them slowly. She had the stupid urge to throw the casserole at his trunk and wondered what the ladies at church would say about that. Back at home, Tommy sat at the kitchen table with the classifieds. "I called your mother to come take the kids for a couple days," he said. You need space." "You mean I need room to unravel without witnesses?" Maggie asked. "I mean I can't watch you pace without trying to fix it," he said. "And I can't fix it." "What if there's something to fix today?" she said. He closed his eyes. "I know you think I'm made of cinder block and sports radio. I'm not. I'm scared down to the marrow, but I can't have our kids remember this house as a place where their mother went feral. I will clean whatever I mess," she said, and then softened because she heard herself and didn't like the woman in that sentence. "Thank you for calling my mother." The doorbell rang. On the stoop, 2 women from St. Mary's, Rita Morales and Gwen from Respiratory, stood with a paper bag of muffins and faces that looked like apologies. Rita handed over the bag. "We took up a little collection," she said. "Not much, $42 and change." "I don't," Maggie began and then stopped because refusing felt like spitting on kindness. "Thank you." Gwen shifted. "Carter, there's something," she said, eyes sliding to Rita and back. "There's this orderly Kevin. He's handsy, likes to hang in the parking lot. He's harmless mostly, but Monday he was sour. Got in a shouting match with an ex by the loading dock." "Does he have a car?" Maggie asked. "Cherry red Nova with 1 gray door," Rita said. "You can hear it coming from Brighton." Maggie called Morneau before the door closed behind the women. He picked up on the first ring. "I've got a maintenance man with a Buick in a parking lot Lothario with a cherry bomb," she said. "Pick your poison." "I can pick too," he said. "Don't follow Branson again." "Why?" "Because if he's dirty, he's practiced, and practiced men make impulsive women into obituaries," he said. "Let me be the impulsive one." She swallowed her retort. "Fine," she said, "but if you die of impulse, I'll haunt you." "That's fair," he said. By afternoon, the rumor mill upgraded its machinery. At Granger's, a man Maggie knew by sight but not name lined over his coffee. "They say the nurse had a whole other life," he murmured to no one and everyone. Rent paid in cash, new bike on a nurse's salary. Maybe she wasn't just giving shots, if you know what I mean. Maggie set her palm flat on his table. "A Schwinn is $58 at Kmart," she said. "If that's your metric for sin, you need to raise the bar." He blinked at her hand on the Formica and then looked away. When she stepped back outside, a flyer she'd tacked to the bulletin board had been defaced in red ballpoint. where girls go when they want to go. She removed it, folded it small, and put it in her pocket. She would keep the ugliness, too. It told a story. At the station, Morneau brought Branson's name to the case meeting. Bell rubbed his face with both hands and made the sound of a man agreeing in principle and disagreeing in practice. "You can't stick a tail on every man who drives a Buick," he said. "We've got 2 burglaries down Jefferson and a rash of catalytic converters walking away like it's Christmas." Walter Branson was fired from Riverside State Hospital for creeping on staff, Morneau said. "That's what my unofficial whisper network says, and he owns 3 parcels on the east side, lots with sheds. You have that on paper?" Bell asked. "Working on it," Morneau said. "Get it on paper," Bell said, "then ask for your tail. Until then, you knock like a Boy Scout and you don't spook him into suing the city." After the meeting, an older detective with breath like throat lozenges pulled Morneau aside. "Word to the wise," he said. "Branson's brother-in-law drinks with a councilman. Councilman doesn't like complaints." "I don't like missing nurses," Morneau said. "Just telling you why your subpoenas might sit on a corner of a desk like mold," the man said. "Remember your pension." "Every day," Morneau said, which was true, and then he went back to his desk and wrote a polite, razor-edged request for personnel records from Riverside State Hospital, and copied it to someone he knew at the county who owed him an ugly favor. That evening, Maggie's mother arrived with a duffel and a bag of grocery store fried chicken and the authority of a woman who'd outlived 2 floods and a war. "I'll put them down early and keep the house straight," she said, not asking. After dinner, Maggie stepped onto the porch with a sweating glass of iced tea because she'd promised Morneau she'd have a witness if she sat. Mrs. Price joined her with a deck chair and a knitting bag. "I brought my nosy," she said, settling in. At 3:41, a black Buick eased onto Oak, the chrome catching a shred of light like a fish flipping. It didn't slow. It didn't have to. It just told them it existed. "You get that?" Mrs. Price asked, but Maggie was already up, walking to the curb with her tea still in hand and something electric under her skin. She lifted the glass as if to toast the car and held it steady as the Buick rolled past. The driver didn't look, or looked and didn't let it show. It was a master class in not acknowledging a human being. "Okay," Mrs. Price said, knitting needles clicking faster. "Okay." At 9 that night, the phone rang. Maggie let it sound once and answered. "You've gotten brave," the whisper said. "That's bad for your children. The only bad for my children is a coward," she said. "Say your name. You're putting the wrong picture on things," he said again, like a man trying keys in a lock. "She left. She wanted to. She left me a grocery list," Maggie said. "She left her pot roast dreams. People who leave on purpose take their lists." Silence, then a soft, displeased exhale. "Don't make yourself a story," he said. "It never ends the way you think." "Mine might," she said, and hung up. She called Morneau. He listened, then said, "He's repeating himself. That means he isn't as clever as he hoped." "Or it means he's patient," she said. "Men like that can stand still for years." "Then we'll make him move," he said. "How?" she asked. He hesitated. "Sometimes you shake a tree and see what falls." "Shake carefully," she said. "He likes knives you can't see." She hung up and went to the kids' room. Her daughter slept sprawled, hair damp at the temples. Her son had both fists clenched around nothing. Maggie sat on the edge of the bunk and watched them breathe until her own breath matched theirs. In the living room, her mother folded laundry with the slow grace of a woman who believed in order as much as oxygen. "Don't let them turn you into a cautionary tale," her mother said without looking up. "I'm already a headline," Maggie said softly. "I just don't know which section yet." 1 street over, a Buick slid into a driveway and stopped so gently you couldn't tell when it had finished. In a second-floor apartment off Lyell, an orderly polished his shoes with a t-shirt and practiced a smile that showed his dimples. At a desk under an unkind light, Morneau printed out a list of Buicks and circled 3 names in pencil as if circles could make a city smaller. And under all of it, the rumor machine kept chewing the same rumor and calling it new, because that was what fear ate when it couldn't find meat. By the end of that first terrible summer, Maggie had learned the shape of nights that didn't end. Then the years came, and with them 1,000 small practicalities that tricked her into pretending to live. Soccer cleats that had to be bought, cavities that had to be filled, a roof that had to be patched after a nor'easter peeled shingles like old bark. Decades stacked. The rumor about Evelyn became a story people told only when they needed to fill air at parties, the way you mention a local legend and move on to the weather. Maggie kept the flyers in a shoebox and the map in a closet, folded to a red river that never dried. In 2002, when her marriage finally folded in on itself with a quiet sigh, no screaming, just the slow discovery that two people could spend 28 years in parallel hallways, Maggie packed her car and drove back to Rochester. Her son was teaching ninth grade English in Cleveland. Her daughter lived in Queens and wore boots in July like a declaration. Maggie rented a small house off Culver, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a squeaky drawer, a yard that needed a person who loved pruning. She told her children she wanted to be near the lake again, and they nodded like people do when a sentence is offered in place of a truth. The city had grown edges she didn't recognize, the new medical complex where sent. Mary's once fit neatly into a single block, a park ribboning where a maintenance yard had stood in the 70s, a strip mall hawking cell phones and discount mattresses on the spot where the penny candy store used to let kids count out their nickels. She bought a city map out of habit and found herself tracing a familiar route with her finger, as if the red line might still be there under layers of paper. On a bright October morning with the kind of blue sky that looks fake in photographs, she walked Evelyn's old path. Not for the first time, she'd done this a dozen times on visits over the years, but for the first time with no return ticket in her pocket. She started at the newly named Mercy East Medical, stood outside the automatic doors, and pictured the old double doors inhaling and exhaling nurses like lungs. She set off down Oak, past a storefront church and a daycare plastered with construction paper leaves. The air smelled like cut grass and distant fryer oil. She didn't mean to cut into the park, her feet did it before she decided. The trail was fresh asphalt, smooth like a promise, but a narrow dirt path veered off into the trees, older, meaner, not official. Maggie hesitated, then turned onto it. It felt like stepping back into a sentence you dropped mid-syllable. Leaves whispered. A jogger passed and nodded without breaking stride. A dog on a leash paused to sneeze at a patch of something pungent, then tugged its owner forward. The dirt path tightened and then opened into a little hollow where the city wasn't. You could forget you were 3 blocks from a nail salon that did $10 Tuesdays. The ground dipped and Maggie stopped. It wasn't the color that snagged her, it was the geometry. Vines ran chaotic, but they bent around a shape that shouldn't have been there. The sun slid and struck metal, a tired flash. She stepped closer, pushing aside a bramble that clung to her sleeve like it had rights. The bicycle lay on its side, half swallowed by 30 years of green and weather. Powder blue paint flaked in big scabs. A wicker basket had collapsed like a rib cage. The front wheel was angled wrong, like it had tried to pivot and found a wall where there shouldn't have been one. For a second, Maggie's brain refused to show her the thing it saw. Then it brought her the smell of ivory soap and hospital starch, and the little scratch on Evelyn's left shin from catching a pedal wrong in 70. No, Maggie said to the bike, the trees, the air. Then, okay. Her hands shook as she crouched. Vines had threaded through the spokes, knitting time to metal. She pressed at the vine with 2 fingers, gentle, like she was moving hair off a sleeping child's face. The frame was pitted, the paint salted away, but numbers live a long time when they're punched into steel. She rolled the bike an inch, enough to see the bottom bracket, and scraped with her thumbnail until the grease and rust gave up a little. SN, then a string of digits, some clear, some guessing at themselves through brown. Hold still, she said to the earth, and then laughed because that was insane and also exactly what you say when you need a small grace. She pulled her wallet, found the yellowing scrap she had carried so long it felt like part of her license. She decopied the serial number from the hospital guard's clipboard in 1972 in careful block letters, and the paper had turned the color of tea. She read the digits out loud and read the ones on the frame back to them like a call and response in church. They matched, not most of them. Not close enough to wish, all of them. Maggie sat back hard in the leaves, bark in her palms, wet earth coming through the seat of her jeans. The sound that left her mouth wasn't a cry anyone could recognize. If sorrow had a language, it was that, vowels with no home. "Ma'am," a voice said, and she turned to see a city worker in a neon vest standing at the edge of the path, rake in hand, concern tightening his brow. "You okay?" Maggie stood, swallowed, pointed. Her fingers shook, but her voice landed. "I found my sister's bicycle," she said. "She went missing in 1972. The man looked from the bike to her and back, measuring whether he was inside a story or a problem. "You want me to call it in? I'll do it," she said, and pulled her cell out with the same sense of awe she still felt every time she used a phone that fit in her pocket. She dialed 911 and said the words slowly, as if clarity could reverse time. The first patrol car arrived in under 5 minutes because the officer had been driving a block away when the call came. He was young enough to still apologize for everything. He put on gloves so new they creaked and told her they were going to secure the scene, a phrase that made her imagine a net over a hole. He asked her to step back, then looked at the bike, looked at her, and did what good people do when the manual doesn't cover it. He said, "I'm sorry," like an offering. By the time the black unmarked sedan pulled in at the curb, Maggie had her palms pressed hard against her thighs to stop the shaking. A woman stepped out, late 30s, hair in a knot that meant business, suit jacket unbuttoned. She flashed a badge before the introduction landed. "Detective Lena Rodriguez," she said. "You're Margaret Carter, Maggie," she said, and found a sliver of humor because grief will let you be human for a second if you push. "Only my mother and the IRS use Margaret." Rodriguez nodded like that detail mattered, then crouched by the bicycle with a tenderness that surprised Maggie. "We'll photograph it in place," she said, speaking for Maggie as much as for the uniform bending to snap shots. "Then we'll bring it up intact if we can. Do you know the serial number?" Maggie held out the scrap of paper. Rodriguez took it without touching Maggie's fingers, a professional respect that read as kindness. She compared, then exhaled in a long, controlled line. "Okay," she said. To the uniform, wide shots, macro of the bracket, frame, basket, any residue. Soil samples near the front wheel. Don't yank anything you can coax. "Coax," the kid said, and grinned at the strange instruction because he was still young enough to be delighted by language even in a ditch. Rodriguez stood and looked at the little hollow the way a carpenter looks at a beam, considering stress points. "This was a maintenance yard," she said. "City converted in 94. Before that, a private lot attached to hang on." She pulled a folded paper from her jacket, an ancient parcel map copied so many times the lines had developed their own ghosting. "This rectangle," she tapped with a clean fingernail. "Branson owned this from 68 until 84. Maggie felt the heat crawl up her neck. "The man with the Buick." "The same," Rodriguez said. "You know the name how?" "Because I stood in his street and said it out loud," Maggie said. "He told me to be careful with waiting." Rodriguez's mouth tightened. Did he now? The crime scene techs arrived with their careful cases and their duct tape and their low voices. One of them nodded at Maggie as if to say, "I see you," without making her part of the evidence. They set flags in the dirt like golfers with better morals. A city parks manager in a polo that had never met dirt appeared and said, "Do you know how many permits we needed to get this land reclaimed? We can't just," and Rodriguez turned and said, "Sir, we can," in a tone that ended the conversation without humiliating him in front of anyone but himself. Maggie stood off to the side and watched them work. The urge to step in and touch the basket, to smooth the dust off the curve where Evelyn's hand would have rested, was so strong it felt like a physical lane. She folded her arms tight across her chest and pressed her nails into the meat of her palms until sensation replaced impulse. She thought of the nights in 1972 when she had sat at her kitchen table with a red pen and the map and the phone, and how useful it would have been to know a day would come when the ground would give something back. "Ms. Carter," Rodriguez said quietly, touching her elbow a half-inch above the fabric so there was contact and not. "I want to hear everything you remember that isn't in a police report. Stuff you didn't say because you thought it was too small. People women notice that men don't. Dogs that barked, new locks. You talk like a person," Maggie said, the compliment surprising both of them. "I talk like someone who's knocked on a lot of doors where a woman vanished," Rodriguez said, "and like someone whose mother would break my kneecaps if I got cocky." They stepped back to the path to make room for a tech to photograph a patch of disturbed earth. Maggie told the story again, this time braiding in the parts she had learned to leave out. The crease that always formed between Evelyn's brows at the end of a 12-hour, the way Evelyn's left shoe squeaked after rain, the habit she had of looping the belt of her uniform twice because once felt like tempting fate. "You keep notes?" Rodriguez asked. Maggie opened her bag and pulled out the small black notebook she'd started in '72 and never stopped. Rodriguez accepted it like it was a fragile organ in transit. She flipped through, eyes catching on dates, addresses, names. "You kept better records than our department," she said, not to flatter, but because it was true. "Detective Morna wanted to do more," Maggie said, surprising herself by defending a man she hadn't seen in 25 years. "He had a sergeant and a budget and a city full of other people's bad days." "I'll talk to him," Rodriguez said, "if he'll take my call." "He will," Maggie said. "He's stubborn." A tech called out, "We've got hair in the chain ring. Old, maybe animal, maybe not." He said it in a tone that promised nothing and invited hope. Rodriguez nodded without turning her head. "We'll bag it. We're not going to get clean DNA off anything that's been in Rochester winters for 3 decades, but we'll try. You never know which miracle belongs to you." She looked back at Maggie. "Do you have someone to come sit with you tonight? This is the part where people think closure is a thing you can buy at Wegmans." "My mother is 90 and will arm wrestle God," Maggie said, "and my neighbor can knit an alibi." Rodriguez smiled, a small crack in a professional face. "Good, because the ugly takes another run at you after the trucks leave." As if on cue, a man in a suit with a city pin on his lapel appeared on the path and said, with an urgent whisper that made him feel important, "Detective, have you looped in communications? We're very concerned about messaging. We're very concerned about a woman who rode a bicycle and never came home," Rodriguez said. "Communications can wait." The man flushed and retreated, muttering something about liability. Maggie watched him go with a kind of exhausted awe. "They're already worried about how it looks," she said. "They always are," Rodriguez said. "Part of my job is to make sure the way it is gets more airtime than the way it looks." The techs lifted the bicycle with the kind of awkward tenderness reserved for heavy infants and old instruments. A fragment of wicker gave up the fight and fell, and Maggie bit the inside of her cheek so she wouldn't make a sound no one could categorize in a report. She watched the bike go up the little rise toward the path and felt time twist, not backward or forward, but into a shape she could finally name, not an answer, not yet, but a door. Rodriguez walked with her to the curb where Maggie's car looked suddenly too bright in the dappled shade. "I'll be in touch this afternoon," the detective said. "We'll start with property records, Branson's employment, the hospital archives. Some of it will be dust. Some of it will be locked in rooms where a county clerk tells me the file is temporarily mislaid. I'll bring a flashlight and a crowbar. You bring your notebook." Maggie nodded, hand on the car door, mine back in 1972 and also here now, with asphalt, leaves, and the unreal fact of a serial number that matched a sentence in her own hand. "Detective," she said, "thank you for talking like this is a person." Rodriguez tilted her face toward the trees for a second, the way people do when they're asking the sky to witness a promise. "It is," she said. "And so are you." Maggie got in, set her palms on the wheel, and let her forehead rest there for a moment like a benediction. When she straightened, she caught her reflection in the rear view, lines where there hadn't been lines, eyes that had decided to stop lying to themselves. She put the car in drive and eased away from the curb, leaving behind a hollow in the trees where, finally, the ground had given up one small, blue truth. Rodriguez didn't take the scenic route. Within an hour of hauling the bicycle out of the hollow, she was in the basement of City Hall, a fluorescent graveyard where records went to sweat and stick together. The clerk on duty, a man with a mustache like a retired caterpillar, pushed a sign-in sheet at her and said, "You're gonna want parcel archives, but Doll is at lunch." "Everyone eats," Rodriguez said. "Where es Doll's key?" "On Doll," he said, tapping his own chest as if to clarify anatomy. Rodriguez slid her card across the counter. "Detective Lena Rodriguez, homicide." If you're about to explain a policy that lets one digestive tract shut down an investigation, stop and get me a supervisor. He considered the hassle-to-paycheck ratio and decided on survival. "Nina will open for you," he said, and disappeared. Nina arrived with a ring of keys that would have made a janitor blush. "Follow me," she said, already rolling her eyes at the building. Parcel archives smelled like paper had learned to rot. Rodriguez slid open a rolling shelf. It complained like an old man. "Branson," she said. "Walter, property transfers, 68 to 84, everything you've got." Nina found 3 deed folders and a stack of maintenance permits, set them on a table, and perched on a stool with a paperback. "Holler if you need me to interpret the hieroglyphics." Rodriguez paged through deeds with the patience she'd learned collecting confessions and Sudoku alike. Look for patterns. Accept boredom as part of the tithe you pay for the truth. Branson had acquired the oak-adjacent parcel in '68 from a salvage company for an amount so embarrassingly low it told a story about handshake deals and holiday bottles. He'd pulled permits for a shed, a fence, a concrete pad. He de-sold the land to the city in '84, not for profit but not for loss, either clean enough to look clean. "Nina," Rodriguez said, "you have employment records for Riverside State Hospital, staff roles, disciplinary actions." Nina barked a laugh. "Lady, that place closed in '69, and when the state shut it, they put half the paper in boxes and half in the trunk of a Buick and drove it into a lake." "Which lake?" Rodriguez asked. Nina glanced up, decided humor might actually help, and pointed at the ceiling. "Metaphorically, detective, try the county archive on Main or the microfiche at the library. You might get lucky." "You look like you could use a miracle." "I prefer leverage," Rodriguez said, stacking the copies she'd made, "but I'll take whatever shows up." She hit the public library next. The microfiche machine squatted in a corner like a machine that had watched marriages dissolve. A teen librarian with a nose ring showed her how to thread film with the compassion of one who'd taught 87 people this month. Rodriguez cranked through 1965 to 1970 editions of the Democrat and Chronicle until her eyes went grainy. There it was, Riverside to close, staff REDUCED, and 2 months later, claims of misconduct, orderly FIRED, no name in the headline. In the body of the piece, a buried mention, maintenance supervisor disciplined following complaints. The sort of line an editor puts in to avoid letters from lawyers. She pulled a phone and called a number she kept for favors. Pete Ullin at the county attorney's office, a man who liked to drink a martini and feel useful. "Pete," she said, "tell me where Riverside's personnel files went when the state turned off the lights." "State warehouse in Buffalo," he said, "or a black hole. If you had a subpoena and a saint, you might see them by Advent." "What about the city purchasing records for the oak parcel?" she asked. "Any flags?" "No flags," Pete said, "but there's a note that environmental concerns were addressed verbally." "Which is bureaucrat, for we don't want to talk about what was under there. Get me whatever you can without growing a target on your tie," she said. "Too late," he said cheerfully. "My wife picks them." By late afternoon, she had a stack of photocopies, 2 post-it notes with phone numbers for retired Riverside staff, and one name she didn't like, a city councilman who'd signed off on the '84 purchase and later chaired a committee on urban beautification. The same councilman whose brother-in-law, according to a detective with lozenge breath, drank with Walter Branson. She drove to a diner that still served coffee in thick white mugs and put ketchup on the table without asking. Maggie was already in a booth by the window, notebook on the formica, eyes bright with a kind of oxygen you only get after you've spent the morning in a hole and found a bone. "Before you tell me anything," Maggie said, "I want to say thank you for showing up in work shoes." Rodriguez smirked. "You'd be surprised what the city issues," she said, sliding in. "You eat toast," Maggie said. "It's staying." Rodriguez ordered a turkey club and 2 coffees. When the waitress left, she set the parcel copies between the salt and the napkin holder. "Branson owned the land in '72, she said. "He pulled a permit for a shed. Riverside fired someone in '69 for misconduct. My bet is it was him. He sold to the city in '84. A councilman with friends helped it along." Maggie took a breath that shuddered. "So the path where the bike was found was his path," she said. "He made it, or he used it," Rodriguez said. "Either way, he knew it better than the city did for a long time." The waitress topped their coffees and left sugar packets like a peace offering. Maggie reached for one and then didn't. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Rodriguez hesitated. "2 things, keep your notebook open and brace yourself for a second storm. When cities realize the past is going to leak onto the present, the first impulse is to patch it with spin." "That man in the polo with the pin," Maggie said. "I will be seeing more pins," Rodriguez said, "and I'll keep pulling focus back to your sister." She slid a handwritten list across to Maggie, names of women who disappeared between '67 and '76, 2 in Rochester, 1 in Irondequoit, 1 in Greece. "I want you to look at these," she said. "Do any ring bells? Did Evelyn mention them? Did they share roots or habits?" Maggie scanned the names, her forefinger underlining them like a prayer. "Donna M. Lee P. Cheryl K. and T. I remember Donna," she said. "Worked at the 5 and Dime on Clinton, took the bus. They said she ran off to Florida. I remember that because in February everyone says that as if it's a real place you can go with a bus ticket." Rodriguez wrote Donna, bus, rumor Florida, and then gently, "How's your mother? Ready to fight a hurricane," Maggie said. "My neighbor Mrs. Price is knitting a net." "Good," Rodriguez said, "because the first anonymous call is adrenaline, the third is exhaustion." As if on cue, Maggie's phone buzzed. Unknown number. They stared at it together like it was a snake on the table. Maggie answered, voice low. "Hello, hello, Margaret," the whisper said. The speaker had graduated to her full name with the false intimacy of a debt collector. "You like to dig. Say your name," she said. "You're making this uglier than it needs to be," the voice said. "You're putting the wrong picture on things," Maggie finished, tired of letting him drive the script. "We've covered that. Tell me the right one." A pause, then she let go. He said, "You can too." "Tell me where you put my sister's bicycle," Maggie said. "Use a proper noun." The line went dead. Maggie set the phone down and breathed out through her nose like someone trying not to swear in front of a priest. Rodriguez was already dialing the call trace into dispatch, giving time, duration, cell tower. "He's repeating himself," she said. "Repetition is either control or panic. Either way, he's telling on his own anxiety." "Points for stamina," Maggie said, and then rubbed her eyes. "Sorry. I get mean when I'm tired. Meanness is just honesty without sugar," Rodriguez said. "We can use it." The waitress slid the turkey club between them with a little flourish to make it normal. Maggie took half because refusing would be disrespect to the universe's attempt at mercy. Rodriguez's phone buzzed this time. Unknown, internal. She listened for 30 seconds and said, "Understood," twice in a tone that did not concede understanding. When she hung up, she speared a pickle and said, "My lieutenant wants me to share high-level updates with communications. Also wants me to pull back on Riverside because the state has stakeholders." "Stakeholders," Maggie said flatly. "Lovely word. Fewer syllables than people who could have stopped something." "I'll tell Com what I tell Com," Rodriguez said, "and I'll keep asking for Riverside files until they mail me a restraining order. Sometimes the insult of the ask shakes loose a thing." "Detective Morneau used to say something like that," Maggie said softly, only with more sighing. They were quiet for a minute, chewing the way you do when your body insists on remaining mortal while your mind sprints. Then Rodriguez said, "He still lives here." "Morno, how do you know?" Maggie asked. "Checked his pension file last year on another case," Rodriguez said. "He retired to the west side. He might still have a copy of his notes. Some of those lost in the evidence room land in good men's garages." "Call him," Maggie said. Rodriguez did. The phone rang 6 times, long enough to suggest a man out in his yard, and then a voice as familiar to Maggie as the smell of her own linen closet said, "Morno." "Detective," Rodriguez said. "Lena Rodriguez, Rochester PD. I'm calling about Evelyn Carter." There was a pause, the kind with history in it. "I always wondered if that call would come for a killer or a miracle," he said. "Neither," Rodriguez said. "A bicycle." He drew a breath that sounded like relief and grief had decided finally to share the same throat. "Where?" "Park off Oak," she said. "Found by her sister this morning. Serial number matches." Another long silence. "Put Maggie on," he said, "if she's there." Rodriguez handed over the phone. Maggie held it like she was receiving last rites. "Jack," she said. "I should have found it," he said, blunt in that way that can't be argued with because it's not asking for permission to hurt. "You had a city to hold up with chewing gum," she said, "and a sergeant who thought Buicks were a civil right." He almost laughed. "You didn't forget my poetry. I don't forget men who showed up," she said. "We found a door. Will you help pry?" "I have a box," he said. "My wife calls it the stubborn box. It's labeled Carter. You can have it. Don't make me cry in Granger S," she said. "People will think the muffins are stale." He gave Rodriguez his address and hung up with the awkwardness of men who have too many feelings and no place to set them down. Rodriguez jotted it, tucked her notes, and left cash on the table that would insult the price of a turkey club in any decade. They drove to Morno's small split level off Lyell, the yard planted with old-fashioned zinnias like the ones Evelyn wanted. He opened the door before they reached the step, as if he'd been standing behind it, receiving courage from the wood. He looked older in the way good men do, lines deepened not by bitterness but by use. He hugged Maggie with one arm, then stepped back as if remembering she had a mother who might object to too much. "I keep it in the garage," he said. Easier to pretend it's a project and not a failure. The stubborn box was a banker's box with a crack in the lid and handwriting that looked like a carpenter S. Inside, old Polaroids of oak and elm the week after the disappearance, copies of Evelyn's schedule, a map with tiny excess that matched Maggie's red line, a list of black sedans registered within 5 miles in 1972, a single-page memo about Riverside that had no signature and less patience. WB reassigned after incidents. Problems with staff boundaries. Do not rehire. "Where did you get this?" Rodriguez asked, tapping the memo. "A nurse," Morno said. "She slid it across a table at O'Malley S and told me if I used her name she'd deny the shape of the alphabet." "You kept it," Rodriguez said. "I kept everything," he said. "Some days so I could keep myself." While they worked, a car rolled by slowly and kept going, a habit Rodriguez's body recorded without needing her brain to take notes. 10 minutes later, her phone buzzed with a number that came up city switchboard. She answered and said nothing until the voice ran out of euphemism. "I appreciate the guidance," she said at last, "but we aren't writing a brochure, we're solving a crime. Tell the councilman we'll brief him when there's something to brief that isn't spin." She hung up and caught Morno watching her with a half-smile. "You'll do," he said. "High praise," Rodriguez said. "Consider making me a sandwich." He did, because feeding people is another way to say you're still in this. They laid papers out on the workbench like a buffet for ghosts. They built a timeline so tight it squeaked. They argued about the weight of witness contradictions with the generosity of people who both know that memory is a magic trick and that sometimes the trick shows you where the coin went. At dusk, Maggie's phone rang again. Same whisper, same script, as if the caller had a hymn and only 2 verses. "You're making this ugly," he breathed. "Let go." She put him on speaker. "You're the one in love with ugly," she said. "Margaret," he said, annoyed at the lack of fear. "You want me to say a name, Walter, there. Does that make you happy?" Rodriguez scribbled WLTER taunt and pointed to the window. Morno was already moving, stepping into the yard to clock the sound of engines, noses twitching like hounds. Maggie kept him on the line. "Walter who?" she asked. "You'd better hope your mouth can spell." Silence, then the click they were learning like a fingerprint. Rodriguez called it in, asked for a rapid ping and a sweep of pay phones within a half-mile. "He's daring us to look at Branson," she said, "either because it's true or because he wants us to spend our calories on the wrong man. Or both," Morno said. Men like that always like both. A cruiser slid by slow, nodding at Rodriguez, a promise of presence if not protection. Inside the garage, the three of them stood with the box like it was a campfire. The air smelled like cut grass and paper, late summer and old decisions. Maggie put one palm on the lid and felt the corrugation like a pulse. "Tomorrow," Rodriguez said, "I go to county to demand Riverside files. I'll get denied, then appeal, then get warned by a deputy counsel about institutional integrity. I'll call a retired nurse and a janitor who both know what lies smell like. I'll pull the 1984 council minutes and circle the names of men who smiled for ribbon cuttings. You," she looked at Maggie, "you keep breathing. And you think about Donna from the 5 and dime. And me?" Morno asked. "You drive past Leon at 3:41, Rodriguez said, "and you remember to look like a man who is not watching." Maggie smiled, a small fierce thing, and felt something settle inside her that wasn't peace or closure or anything so polite. It was readiness. It felt like what she imagined a runner felt at the crown of a hill, the point where your lungs burn and your legs insist on becoming animals and the view just begins to break open. The morning after the call that spat Walter's name into the dark, Maggie was awake before sunrise, sitting at her kitchen table with her coffee going cold. She stared at the map she'd redrawn from memory, marking the parcel Rodriguez had traced to Branson in a thick black square. There was a line there, almost invisible under the faded ink, an old path that seemed to snake deeper into the wooded edge of the park. She couldn't stop thinking about it. By mid-morning, she was in the Rochester Public Library's local history room, poring over a stack of aerial photographs from the 1970s. The librarian, a tall man with reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, tapped a grainy black and white image. "You see that?" he asked. "Before the city graded it for parkland, this section here, see the shadow? That was a structure, small. Probably a shed or outbuilding. Right where the bike was found," Maggie said, feeling a small, sharp jolt in her chest. She copied the coordinates into her notebook, thanked the librarian, and left without telling Rodriguez or Morno. Some part of her knew it was reckless. Another part knew she wouldn't sleep if she didn't see it herself. The path was quieter than it had been the day she found the bike. The air was cooler, damp with last night's rain. She followed the dirt trail until she found what she'd been looking for, a cracked slab of concrete, moss clinging to the edges. Around it, rusted metal scraps poked from the soil like bones that didn't want to stay buried. She crouched, brushing away leaves. That's when she saw it, just at the corner where the slab had shifted, a patch of earth that looked disturbed, looser than the rest. She pulled the small gardening trowel from her bag. It was supposed to be for her yard. It was about to be for something else entirely. 10 minutes of careful scraping brought her trowel against metal. She dug wider, easing it up until she uncovered a rusted box, no bigger than a shoebox, sealed with a simple latch. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her jaw. She pried it open. Inside, wrapped in cracked plastic, was a stack of objects, driver's licenses, each with the smiling face of a young woman, 7 in all, a pair of small gold earrings, a hospital name badge with a faded photo. And then her breath hitched, a photograph of Evelyn taken candidly outside St. Mary's. Evelyn's hands were on her bicycle's handlebars, her head turned slightly, unaware she was being watched. On the back, in neat block letters, June 10, 1972, the world seemed to tilt. She sat back hard in the damp leaves, clutching the photo like it might blow away. A twig snapped behind her. She turned, startled, to see Rodriguez standing there, Morno a few steps back. "You want to tell me why I'm getting a call from the Parks Department about a civilian with a trowel on an active crime scene?" Rodriguez asked, her voice tight but not yet angry. I had to see, Maggie said. I couldn't wait for another meeting, another memo about jurisdiction. She's my sister. Rodriguez knelt beside her, gloved hands reaching for the box. You understand this is evidence. I understand it's been sitting here for 30 years while everyone looked in the wrong direction, Maggie said, her voice rising. And now you have it, now you can't ignore him. Morno's eyes flicked over the contents and settled on the photo of Evelyn. His jaw tightened. You realize what this means. These aren't just trophies, they're records. He kept them organized. That's not impulse, that's system. Rodriguez was already snapping photos on her department-issued camera. We'll log every item, photograph the serial numbers on the IDs, run them against missing persons. And what if some of them were never reported? Maggie asked. What if no one cared enough to file a report? Then we care now, Rodriguez said, looking her straight in the eye. They packed the box into an evidence bag. Maggie felt the loss as it left her hands, but also a grim relief. At least now it wasn't buried. On the walk back to the cars, Morno fell into step beside her. You know, he said quietly, if he knows you found this, he's going to try and rattle you again. You've already been his project for 30 years. I've been his project, she said, heat flaring. No, my sister was, I'm just what's left. They stopped at the curb where their vehicles were parked. Rodriguez looked between them. This changes the case, she said, but it also makes it harder. Some of these women may be from other counties, maybe even other states. That's more agencies, more politics, and Branson's dead, which means no arrest, no trial, no confession to wrap it in a bow for the public. Then we make the bow out of something else, Maggie said. We tell the truth. Rodriguez gave her a long look, part warning, part respect. That's the part they'll fight us on the hardest. Maggie glanced at the evidence bag in Rodriguez's hand. Then they'd better be ready for a long fight. Rodriguez sighed, unlocking her car. You just volunteered yourself for every late-night call and every closed-door meeting with someone who wishes you disappear. Good, Maggie said. They can stand in line. As Rodriguez drove off toward the lab, Morno lingered another minute. You know, finding that box, you've basically kicked a hornet's nest full of politicians, old cops, maybe even families who'd rather believe their daughter ran away than. He trailed off. I know what's in that box, Maggie said, and I'm not afraid of their hornets. He studied her for a beat, then nodded. Just don't forget hornets sting. When she got home, she set her notebook on the kitchen table, opened to a fresh page, and wrote in block letters at the top, the box. Underneath, she began listing each name, each object, each thread that might pull the whole thing open. She didn't hear the car pass slowly down her street until it was already turning the corner, a black Buick, chrome glinting in the late sun. She went to the window and stood there until it was gone, her reflection in the glass looking back at her with something new, something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite hope but had teeth. By the time the box's contents were catalogued at the lab, the story had already begun to leak. It started with a single post on a neighborhood forum, someone claiming to have heard from a friend at the parks department that a missing nurse's sister had dug up something tied to multiple disappearances. By evening, a reporter from Channel 8 was calling Maggie's phone. Rodriguez warned her, if you speak to them, you'll lose control of the narrative. The wrong sound bite and they'll twist it into a ghost story or a smear job. They've already been smearing her for 30 years, Maggie said. At least this way I get to talk about the facts. But the facts had teeth, and she wasn't the only one they bit. The interview aired the next night, Maggie seated at her kitchen table, Evelyn's hospital portrait in front of her, her voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. She described the discovery of the bicycle, the rusted box, the photograph of her sister. The broadcast cut to B-roll of the wooded trail, yellow tape sagging in the breeze, and a blurred still of Branson from an old driver's license. By morning, Rodriguez's phone was full of messages from the chief, the city's public information officer, and 2 separate advisors from the mayor's office. At their next meeting in the precinct conference room, the tension was thick enough to taste. Rodriguez shut the door before she spoke. You've got council members demanding we walk this back. They're saying we can't implicate a deceased man without definitive proof. Maggie sat forward. We have proof. We have his property records, the box found where his shed stood, IDs from women who vanished when he lived there. If that's not enough for them to say his name, they don't want enough, Rodriguez cut in. They want silence. Morneau leaned against the wall, arms crossed. This is what they do. They wait out the outrage, let it cool, then stick it in a file labeled resolved for PR purposes. They're not going to wait me out, Maggie said. I've been waiting since '72. Rodriguez met her eyes. If you keep going public, they'll come at you harder. They'll question your credibility, maybe even imply you planted the evidence. The words hit like a slap. They wouldn't. They would, Morneau said, and they've done worse. The conference room phone rang. Rodriguez ignored it. We have a choice: play by their rules long enough to get the lab results and tie Branson to at least one victim beyond Evelyn, or burn it all down now and risk losing access to half the evidence. Maggie's hands tightened into fists on the table. If we wait, they get time to bury things again. If we go now, maybe we pull others into the light. Others or yourself, Rodriguez said quietly. This isn't just about justice, it's about survival. The door opened without a knock. The chief stepped in, a tall man with the air of someone used to delivering bad news like it was a favor. Detective Mrs. Carter. I've been told you're planning another interview. I'm here to strongly advise against it. Advise or order? Maggie asked. Call it both, the chief said. We're dealing with potential liability here. If families of those other women sue, it's the city's name on the paperwork. It's their daughters' names on headstones, Maggie shot back. His jaw tightened. This is bigger than one case. No, she said, standing now, her voice shaking but strong. This is exactly one case, Evelyn Carter, and if you can't say her name without a lawyer in the room, then I will. For a beat, no one moved. Then the chief gave a tight nod, like a man conceding a chess piece but not the game. Just remember, when the blowback comes, you won't like where it lands. He left, closing the door harder than necessary. Morneau exhaled through his nose. That's a promise, not a threat. Rodriguez's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from a lab tech, partial prints on 2 licenses. Possible match to Branson, confirming with AFIS. She looked up at Maggie. We might have him on paper soon. Just be ready for them to say it's still not enough. Maggie's voice was steady. It'll never be enough for them, but it's enough for me to keep going. She gathered her notebook, the same one she'd been filling for 30 years, and headed for the door. Out in the hall, she passed a junior officer whispering into a phone, glancing at her like she was already a headline, and maybe she was. But she decided she could live with that, so long as Evelyn's name was in print right beside hers. The lab results came back on a Wednesday afternoon, delivered in the clipped voice of a tech who'd been told to keep it short. Partial print on one of the driver's licenses matches Walter Branson. Rodriguez read aloud in the cramped evidence office. No hit on the others, too degraded. Trace fibers consistent with hospital uniforms from the late 60s to early 70s on the hospital badge. That's all they'll put in writing. Maggie's eyes burned. That's all. That's enough too. It's enough to make a detective's blood run hot, Rodriguez said, sliding the folder closed. It's not enough to force the city's hand if they don't want to move. Morneau was leaning in the doorway, his face a study in the kind of frustration only years on the job could carve, which means they'll hide behind insufficient evidence and hope the public buys it. Maggie dropped into the chair opposite Rodriguez's desk. So that's it, we have a match to a man who owned the land, built the shed, kept the trophies, and harassed women at his job, and they're still going to act like it's a coincidence. Rodriguez's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, jaw tightening. Chief wants me in his office. Alone. I'll come, Maggie said immediately. You won't, Rodriguez replied. Because they're already looking for a reason to paint you as an unstable civilian meddling in an active investigation. Let me take the heat. Lena, Rodriguez cut her off with a raised hand. You fought for 30 years. You can give me 30 minutes to try and keep this case alive without them shoving it into a drawer. When she was gone, Morneau stepped into the room and closed the door. They're going to try to make her pick her job or your case. Maggie looked up sharply. And what will she pick? He hesitated. She's the kind who'll try to keep both, but I've seen how this works. Politics eats good cops alive. So we take it to the press again, Maggie said. That's exactly what they want you to do, he countered, so they can call it a media stunt and discredit everything. Maggie's fists tightened in her lap. If they bury her along with Evelyn, I don't care how loud they call it a stunt. At least people will hear her name. The door opened. Rodriguez was back, her expression unreadable. She tossed her badge onto the desk like it weighed a pound more than it had an hour ago. What did they say? Maggie asked. They said I'm off the case, Rodriguez replied. Officially, it's because I violated the chain of custody by letting a civilian. She shot Maggie a look that wasn't unkind. Handle recovered evidence. Unofficially, it's because I won't stop saying Branson's name in rooms where it makes people uncomfortable. Morneau swore under his breath. They're folding the whole thing, aren't they? They're moving it to cold case again, Rodriguez confirmed. Which means no budget, no dedicated investigator, no urgency. The file will sit until someone retires and a rookie gets told to take a look if you have time. For a moment the room was silent except for the low hum of the vending machine in the hall. Then Maggie stood. No, she said. No what? Rodriguez asked. No, it's not going back in a drawer. You have your notes, Jack has his box. I have 30 years of names and dates. We don't need their blessing to keep pulling. Morneau gave her a long look. You're talking about running an investigation without a badge. That's not just stubborn, it's dangerous. So is waiting, Maggie shot back. Evelyn waited for someone to notice, and she's been waiting ever since. I'm done with that. Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, a slow, grim smile forming. You know there's no rule against me talking to retired detectives or private citizens, not if it's over coffee. Morneau raised an eyebrow. You're going to freelance this. Call it independent research, Rodriguez said. If the department's not paying me to find answers, I'll just do it on my own time. Maggie felt a flicker of something she hadn't let herself feel in weeks, momentum. Then we start with the other names in that box, every family, every friend, every coworker who might remember something they didn't think mattered. And if you stir up the wrong person, Morneau asked. Maggie's gaze was steady. I've been living with the wrong person's shadow for half my life. I'm not scared of it anymore. Rodriguez's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from an unlisted number. Stop now or watch another sister vanish. She turned the screen toward Maggie and Morneau. Looks like the shadow doesn't like the light. Maggie's voice was low but sure. Then we're going to shine it so bright he can't breathe. Rodriguez slid the phone into her pocket, already thinking about the next step. Okay, we go around the brass, we go to the people, but we do it smart, no cornered hornet moves. We build the case so tight that when it breaks, not even the city can duct tape it back together. Morneau pushed off from the wall. If we're doing this, I'll pull old contacts in the other counties. Some of these victims, if their families are still around, they'll talk to me before they'll talk to a uniform. Maggie exhaled, steadying herself, and I'll talk to the press again, but this time we give them enough that they can't cut it down to a rumor. Rodriguez gave a curt nod. Then we work fast, because the longer this stays unofficial, the more dangerous it gets. Maggie almost smiled. Good. Let them try to scare me. They should have thought of that before they left my sister in the dark for 30 years. No one in the room said what they were all thinking, that this wasn't just about Evelyn anymore. It was about every name in that box, and about making sure the next one never got written. 2 weeks later, Rochester was buzzing like a hive someone had kicked. The Democrat and Chronicle ran a Sunday front page spread with the headline, Cold Case Breakthrough, Sister Uncovers Possible Serial Predators Trophies. Underneath was a photo of Maggie in her kitchen, Evelyn's portrait on the table between her hands. The article named the other women whose IDs were found in the box, recounted their disappearances, and most damningly tied all of them to properties once owned by Walter Branson. It was the kind of coverage Maggie had wanted for decades, and it was the kind of coverage the city's power structure hated. Rodriguez's phone lit up with blocked calls she ignored. Morneau reported an unmarked sedan parked across from his house 2 nights in a row. Maggie came home to find her mailbox pried open and its contents scattered in the street. "They're trying to make you feel exposed," Rodriguez told her over coffee one morning. "Classic intimidation. I've seen it before, make the witness doubt their safety. Maybe they'll sit down and shut up." Maggie took a long sip, then set the mug down. "They've had 30 years to scare me. If they couldn't do it when I was 29 and my sister had just vanished, they sure as hell can't do it now." The three met that afternoon in Morno's garage, the stubborn box on the workbench, newspaper clippings and property maps spread out like a war table. "We've got families of 3 of the women ready to speak on record," Morno said. "One in Greece, one in Henrietta, and Donna's sister down in Irondequoit. They're tired of the ran away to Florida story." Rodriguez nodded. "We get their statements, match timelines, cross-reference Branson's work logs and property transfers. We make it impossible to ignore the pattern." Maggie tapped the map. "We also show the public where they should have looked years ago. Let people see the city didn't just miss this, they avoided it." Rodriguez's eyes flicked to her. "You understand, once we do that, there's no going back. They'll come after your reputation, maybe even try to bury you in legal trouble." "Let them," Maggie said. "If Evelyn's name has to drag mine through court to get the truth out, I'll wear it like a badge." 2 days later, they filmed a joint interview with all 3 families in Donna's sister's living room. The women sat shoulder to shoulder on a worn floral couch, photographs of their missing sisters in their laps. "They told me she wanted to start fresh," Donna's sister said into the camera, voice trembling. "She never even had a driver's license until they found hers in that box. She didn't start fresh, she was taken." When the segment aired, it sparked calls from viewers who remembered seeing Branson in their neighborhoods, or had stories about his sudden disappearances from jobs, or whispered warnings from nurses at Riverside State Hospital. Rodriguez sifted through the tips, calling in the most credible. Morno drove to Geneva to interview a retired groundskeeper who swore Branson kept a locked shed no one was allowed in at a property there. Maggie's phone never stopped ringing. Some calls were leads, some were thank yous, and some were just heavy breathing before a click. Late one night, Maggie was sorting through her notes when a letter slid under her front door. She froze, listening, but heard no footsteps. The envelope was unmarked. Inside was a single Polaroid, black and white, grainy, of a woman on a bicycle, smiling at something off frame. Not Evelyn. The date on the back was May 3, 1970. She called Rodriguez immediately. "That means there's more we don't have," Rodriguez said. "More victims, and someone's letting you know they've got their own archive." "Or they're letting me know they can get to my door," Maggie said. "Either way, we don't scare," Rodriguez replied. "We use it. We go public with the photo, see if anyone recognizes her." The next day, the image ran on the evening news. Within hours, an elderly man called in. He said the woman was his cousin Leigh, missing since 1970 after leaving her job at a laundry service. She'd been riding her bike home. That broke the dam. With Leigh identified, the press dug harder. Old police reports were unearthed. Former Riverside employees, now in their 70s and 80s, spoke on background about Branson's behavior, the way he lingered in women's locker rooms, how he offered rides to nurses walking home, the complaints that got lost before reaching HR. The mounting pressure forced the department to hold a press conference. The chief, flanked by city attorneys, called the evidence compelling but inconclusive. He refused to declare Branson responsible. Maggie stood at the back of the room, jaw set, and when the conference ended, she walked straight to the podium. Cameras flashed. "My sister's name is Evelyn Carter," she said into the microphones. She was 32 years old. She rode her bike home from work one afternoon and never made it. Her bicycle was found 30 years later on land owned by Walter Branson, along with a box of IDs and photographs of other missing women. If you think that's inconclusive, ask yourself who benefits from keeping it that way. Security moved toward her, but not before every news station had her statement recorded and ready to air. That night, the 3 of them sat in Maggie's kitchen. Rodriguez's badge was gone for good now. She'd handed in her resignation that morning. Morno had made it clear he wasn't coming back in any consulting role. He was in it as a citizen now, nothing more. You realize what you've done, Morneau said to Maggie. I've made it so Evelyn's name can't be pushed back into a file cabinet, she said. Rodriguez smiled faintly, and maybe made it so none of those other names can either. They raised coffee mugs in a quiet toast, not to victory, because that wasn't what this was. It was to endurance, to staying in the fight long enough that the truth had a chance. Outside, the street was quiet. No black Buick, no unmarked sedan, just the cold night air coming off the lake. For the first time in decades, Maggie let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the shadow was starting to lift.